All right. Some more comments on the paper.
You need to go out.
No, you can stay there. That's fine. You're absolutely right. Why would you stand here? In fact, I would rather prefer to have a round circle kind of setup because it's more like a discussion-y setting. But it is how it is right now, so that's all right. Perhaps we can think about it for the future. But any other more comments before for the paper? And afterwards, I give some feedback on the presentations. And because it's the first one to give some impression what the future may hold. Other views, because not necessarily related to method or content or whatever else. Do you have other impressions when reading the paper? That's more the rest of the ones that actually read the paper. I know, again, that may have been tied for some. Yep, please.
I'm not sure if I remember correctly, but
Please.
I think the survey said something, or the paper said something about how the paper wasn't like, or the research wasn't like complete. It was more like they were trying to find if using these kinds of games was a viable option for these kinds of settings. And I actually think that even though there's a lot of flaws in the paper, there is like something there about the engagement. Because when you get in a setting like that with new people and you're like in a new country and you're not sure where you are or what you're doing, I think that getting like the extra push to engaging in conversation and making yourself or putting yourself out there is valuable. So at least there's that. That's positive because it's mostly been negative so far.
Yeah. I think that's part of a scientific exercise, but moreover, particularly of computer science, we tend to be hypercritical. So we always see the negative. We're like, I don't know. Some of you should ask us why not jumping off the cliff immediately. But so it's like it's good to highlight positive things as well. It's absolutely right. So I think. If and Rune alluded to it, even though he doesn't agree it's a serious game, he agrees that it stimulates interaction. Right?
Well, I agree it's a game, but I said that they didn't measure the gaming part of it. What they measured was something much bigger, an intervention. I agree with you. The intervention looks very good, and they should continue.
Yeah. So there is some positive about it in terms of they get something possibly done, right? So they don't quite know if they get it done, but possibly there's something there. So that's good. So. Using an interesting what's the interesting aspect about the nature of the serious games? The serious game that will be particular interesting / uninteresting for the computer scientists amongst you.
Analog.
There was completely no tech, right? So that was a non-tech game. It's just an example that serious games doesn't mean text. It often does, in fact, nowadays, but doesn't necessarily need to be. So that was a good example for a case where it's not there. Rune.
But one thing related to what we talked about last week, one thing that the designers could think about for the next version, so if they would like to go along the path of gaming, what they could think about is, so it's about individualism versus collectivism, but the gaming element was just individual. So could they have any games that would be played as a team-based or group-based games and give awards for the contributions in a team rather. So team-based gaming, as I talked about last time, if that's, especially if you like to encourage multiculturalism, you could give scores to the teams based on some certain key performances or group team performances rather than individual performances. So that's something that they could have explored, and I think it might be worth exploring. Yeah. But then they will need to spend more than 1 hour on their whole intervention. So
the explanation in particular is right. So that's a very good point. Again, there could be I don't know, I said carefully, there could be a cultural bias in there. I don't know if I'm allowed to pitch it this way. But this is an angle, right? So you comment, because just expanding on it, we are in our teaching practice also encouraged to put in many respects more group-based exercises there, because it may respond better to cultural backgrounds and so on and abilities.
I was just thinking to expand on Lin's point.
Yeah, please.
So if you get a coin for each person that agrees with you, you could potentially have players that would care more about winning than being honest, so they would disagree with players even though they actually agree, just to keep that person from getting more points.
Yeah. So there's kind of second order strategies that suddenly come in, right? So that some people may actually play and the other ones either don't understand or ignore, right? So I think everyone understands the dynamics there, but it's a good point. So there could be an adverse effect of the serious game in terms of introducing competitive behaviors, right? So that was mentioned by the authors as well more generally, that there was a bit of a risk of having too competitive arrangements. There again, groups would alleviate this, right? So That's. But again, it probably also depends on the nature of the cultures you're dealing with, right? This was set in the Swedish culture, which is on the feminine side, so more quality of life oriented as opposed to competition. So that's probably okay. Would have been okay in that context, possibly. But you're right. If you want to generalize it, definitely, that's a good point. Other comments? Please.
One little thing I found was that the report was written in a pretty easy language.
Mm-hmm.
It was easy to read. That's one thing I found. It's just a little detail, but
Yeah. So fairly accessible, right?
accessible.
Yes. And I appreciate that feedback, because if some of you, especially the ones that are good health, be mindful, because the language there is quite a different one, right? So they are really rough, really tough to read. This one is really accessible. I mean, but it also makes it easy to detect flaws, because the more formal, more jargon people use, the less likely the reader is to criticize, right? So because it puts a formal barrier of competence or whatever else, right? So in front of the author, so sometimes that's good. So it's very honest to let down the guard and write in a way that people can actually understand. I mean, they can also criticize. Yeah. So that's a good point. I agree with
Yes,
this.
and you have there's a tendency to when you read a report that's written really formally and really stodgy and hard to read, you kind of automatically think that, oh, these people must really know what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Can't make any mistakes.
Exactly, right? So on the note on mistakes, did anyone find mistakes in the paper?
I found lots of typos.
Yeah. Right, so a bit too many, right?
A bit too many.
Bit too many. So that was a bit of a smell. I mean, that's something to be mindful as well. It can give a subtle, at least an indication of the quality of the paper as well. It's just like that, because it's two ways. Number one, there's things like spell checkers around. So even if you're don't feel confident, or even if you're dyslexic, for example, that's not a problem at all. You should just choose a spell checker, Grammarly for expression or whatever else. Use the tools at hand. Authors haven't done it. Sometimes it also says something about the journalists, because the journalists didn't do their job in doing the typesetting right, or didn't have an iteration for proofreading. That can sometimes be indicative. So yeah, I was a bit negatively surprised on those grounds. Yep. Other impressions? So now we looked at method a bit. Now we're talking a bit about presentation of the paper. Looking at the beginning of the paper, any thoughts there? Is that the part you conveniently overread in the paper because you want to get quickly to the meat of the paper, to the interesting bit? Yeah, not. Yeah, so sad. So they had some sort of lit review in the beginning, right? Not sure? Okay. So how was that written, the lit review? What kind of literature review was that? We talked about a few types.
It gives a definition of the culture,
Yeah.
and then talk about previous work,
Yeah.
like other serious games.
Yeah, that's correct. How are the games organized? Oh, the discussion, how is it organized? Right. So first price a high level introduction of what the culture thing is about and so on, and get into serious games and then get into your own concept. That's correct. Is it a systematic literature review? Less so, right? So we're missing a table and a figure that would indicate that it's a sys review. Right? So probably should write an algorithm for this, how to detect this my systematic lit review. So it's probably more, what was the other types of lit reviews we had? Or at least the other type, the major type? I'm debugging my own lectures. They are completely useless apparently. Forget it. I just next time I'll just send the slides out and then you guys can figure it out otherwise. So, but there are other types of lit reviews that I briefly alluded to. There was this figure that was there. No? Cool. Will become exam question. So it was a narrative review, right? So it was not really centered around having the ambition to capture the field comprehensively, right? So it was not that at all, but it was centered around the narrative, around the flow that the paper wanted to convey. They somehow wanted to hone in into their discussion about games for cultural contextualization, right? And they got increasingly narrow in their discussion, starting relatively wide, and then becoming narrower, listing certain games' advantage, disadvantages. And they have this nice transition then to the next discussion point, and then having ideally narrowed the path sufficiently enough came, to provide an opening for their concept, right? So it's a bit of an storytelling abilities that you kind of want to sometimes read out of the paper. They didn't do a bad job at all. I think they connected them okay. Sometimes you get really bad lit reviews, and they literally read like summary, right, without any connectives. So here they kind of nearly got the corner, nearly got it right. So there's still sometimes it's a bit clunky, but they link the argumentation accordingly, right? So those paragraphs are not read in isolation, but they kind of show a certain level of coherence. So I think that was okay in the paper. So it was in this side like quite readable, and I felt I got the impression that I know enough to contextualize their work, within the immediate boundaries of other works that exist, not in the entire field, right? But just in terms of what other things or other games they talk about. And you guys dissected the paper very nicely, right? You actually took it literally apart. So it was a very nice exercise in terms of content, lit review, and so on. So that was very helpful to get this going. What other comments did I have? The protocol. So yeah, one thing sometimes when many of those papers, especially if they are relying on intervention studies such as this experiential setting, it's probably quite nice to think about what would help a bit more for making this assessment a bit easier and discussion a bit easier. Should ask more questions, get less answers. Well, sometimes laying out the. Sorry, there was Björn. You just want to say anything?
Yeah,
Sorry.
you gave it a I think that maybe you could have older papers also read through them. Is that what you mean?
Just repeat louder.
Reading all the papers also. That's working the same thing.
Yes, that's for the. That's right. So a bit more contextualization there, but it's also for the readers as well as for the writers. What I meant is, since the interventions are so reasonably well defined, right? I have a certain preference for papers that lay them out in some sort of schematic form, right? I want to see number of participants. I want to see the sequence and how it actually performs. It's much easier to judge. Here you sometimes need to go through, okay, how many people again? Does that make sense? apart from that one, that's an interesting find anyway. But so you can actually, because those processes are reasonably standardized, so it would be really easy to just have a figure to outline this one, discuss it alongside this. I feel sometimes it gives papers more credibility if they're explicit about all the individual steps and what happened at what given point in time. And here they sometimes obscure it, come back to it, but not really, and then it's kind of a bit of a searching the needle in a haystack sometimes with respect to that. Okay, what's the time now? Anyone has time things?
43.
What? Sorry?
1:43.
Oh, yeah, I need to wrap up. Okay.
50 minutes.
Okay, let's wrap this up. Cool. So we have a paper here. Overall, what grade would you give the paper? Actually, should I ask before the discussion? The next time after the discussion. So after discussion, what grade would you give the paper? From A to F. Don't worry, I'm not writing it down. It's just, yeah.
I think it's a pass, but
I
I think it's very low pass.
A low pass. Where do you see it roughly?
D.
D. Okay. Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah. D.
Yep. Anyone else? No. All
So
D.
so D is on the lower end of the spectrum.
It's lower end of pass. It's
Okay.
It's slightly higher than E. E is like a just pass. Don't aim for an E ever, because it's such a narrow
at
band.
the same time, C is a very broad.
See,
so
that's why I'm opening discussion.
yeah.
So yeah, that's the thing. The
Weak C, strong D.
NTU grading scheme is very so the outer edges are reasonably narrow. It becomes very wide in the middle. C is a massive space, usually covering 2 marks ranges in other countries. So still D. C minus, B plus.
It is C, but
Yeah.
it lacks again the actual, as I said, enough participants.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a good point. Again, I can't repeat it. So sometimes when I'm reading papers and judging reading papers, considering papers, you're absolutely right. You assess the certain parameters such as participant numbers and sampling in general. But what I'm more looking after than this necessarily is that the authors realize and admit it, right? In this case, they did it, so that's okay, right? They're very clear that this paper should not be taken, as in its own right? It's just trying something out, basically, right? We have a tentative idea. Let's see if someone else can do it better, right? Because they list the shortcomings, so that's okay. I mean, on this side, they diffuse the own situation. Of course, it doesn't have the significance of the paper saying, "Wow, this is revolutionizing the field," right? Multiculturalism, serious games, but it's okay, right? So that's not entirely deadly, but. Looking at the overall presentation, the method was reasonably solid. There are some flaws perhaps in design. You have some comments? No? The lit review was sufficient, I think. So I think it would be still in the C range, I guess. What is a bit lacking is the presentation. That's not cool. They could have done a better job. It's just too easy nowadays to get a reasonably flawless paper out in terms of typos and so on. But at least the grammar was somewhat on, right? Yeah. Good. So thank you very much. Some feedback in terms of focus and expectations. So in terms of the awareness, the discussion of today was largely centered around literally one paper, right? So we really focused on this paper, which is good in terms of dissecting a paper and getting practice in it, which we do again and again and again. You will get a lot of practice in it. But what we're missing a bit is the high-level overview of the awareness theme more generally, right? So it would have been nice in the introduction, and I admit that you sent me a question I hadn't responded on time. That's on me in part, but to highlight the field, just find some games basically that visualize awareness, how they're used, even informally. It doesn't need to be scientific papers, right? Provide an overview of what has been done, right? So environmental awareness, or in perhaps safety awareness, so that is more addressed at everyone here really in terms of the presentation. So the first hour should be can be sitting more or less, or the first part of it can be completely sitting outside of that paper, right? The paper comes at the end, we hone in and using this as an example, but outside of this you can show whatever you like. You can literally browse the internet and see what you find in terms of videos, tutorials. Papers, sure, if you want, theories that relate, right? So the motivation theories was a sensible link, I agree. But see if you can make more of a independent component of this first bit, and then the second bit hone in on the paper, right? So, and conversely, the second bit was very well done. You really went into and zoomed into the paper to an extent that many of us wouldn't have needed to read the paper anymore because he gave us all the details of the paper, which can be slightly more high level, I think. But in this case was good because of the late recognition of the paper by everyone else. Again, my fault. So we'll streamline this a bit for the upcoming sessions. So that's the expectation basically that we have. I would say. I think your first part was about 7 minutes. That probably should be more like 20-25. That's the expectation there, and then the paper. So that would be a precedent for the future groups. Again, you're doing the first round. You didn't get much of a substantive instruction there because I kind of want to leave it a bit. But that's more prospective for the future groups to come. So you have a new challenge level to master. Next week we don't have a group present, so meaning I present. It means one more paper for you, not quite sure what I'm talking about. One of the things is serious games design. The other one is about player types, which we haven't covered yet. That's relevant for the gamers may know this, others not, because there's also consideration of how do we need to shape different games for different types of players, if you like. Cool. With this, I leave it at this. Any questions, thoughts? Worries? Yeah, Björn, please.
How many papers is it up to 2%? Per group?
Present in the beginning?
For discussion.
Per group.
To 2 max. I would not do max more because it kind of really depends how deep the papers go. and what you want, because you can say we present two papers to contrast them, right? So if you have, for example, the paper today, right, and the second one it does this because you find some that is quite similar or does the same thing or whatever you mentioned to it. You mentioned it contextualize it with papers that take the same methodological pathway. Then it's really nice to put them side to side and look at it, right? Then more from a bird's eye view, probably less looking at the nitty-gritties. That's permissive. Kind of anything go by. I wouldn't go much more than two papers realistically, because it simply becomes very hard to look at those papers with any sort of scrutiny, right? So, and again, everyone needs to read them. So, realistically, that success will go down with increasing number of papers. So, having perhaps two in a larger group setting and so on, that may be quite interesting. I mean, I don't think we had this comparative approach yet, but this would be quite interesting to try out. So not more than this, no way, right? So, and you're welcome to eat if you need more time, of course. In theory, eat into the second hour as well, right? For the, if you need for discussion or introduction of papers.
But it might be worth reading a couple of more papers.
That's right.
Just for the background, to
That's
set
right.
the stage and to show a little bit what are the hot topics in the area. So,
Yeah.
but the
Yeah.
ones we go in depth,
Yeah,
you
that's
don't
right.
have to go too many papers.
Runa's point is spot on. So you want to be, if you talk about something about a theory, read up on the theory as well a bit, right? So like so you give some motivation on the theory or
Or the instruments being used.
the instruments that are being used, or if you look at other serious games, look into a bit more perhaps the background or where have they been used in studies and so on. Sometimes even on aspects that go beyond what you're actually presenting, right? So just to be ready for getting questions from the audience and so on. That's the idea there. So kind of know the field to some extent. And the fields, again, are super fuzzy here, right? And always selective. It's not like you get a comprehensive overview in 20 minutes or 25 minutes, but that's some sort of angle so people go away with an impression, okay, I know what this topic means in the context of serious games. Yeah. Cool. That's all for today. Thank you very much for your attention. And thank you mostly for your presentation and preparation, jumping in the deep end of the pool, right? So. The other ones will be easier. You're getting the what's the complementary the barn, the baby thing, so
The baby pool.
the baby pool. That's right. So you can jump in the baby pool, so you get an easier one. Cool. Thank you very much.
It's warm water there.